Mrs. Amina was living a happy life with her only son, Omar, who was 7 years old. Omar was a beautiful and intelligent child, and he loved playing with his friends in the street. But one day, a terrible accident happened. Omar was playing in the street when a car hit him. The accident was horrific, and Omar was taken to the hospital, but he died shortly after. Mrs. Amina was very sad. She felt that a part of her heart had been torn apart. She was always crying and felt empty and lonely. After some time had passed since Omar's death, Mrs. Amina decided to visit the graveyard to see her son's grave. She wanted to spend some time with him and feel his presence. On the way to the graveyard, Mrs. Amina was driving slowly. She felt sorrow and emptiness. Suddenly, her car stopped because a shepherd boy was crossing the road. The shepherd was a small child about 8 years old. The shepherd apologized to Mrs. Amina, saying, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to hold you up." Mrs. Amina replied, "Don't worry, my son. I'm not in a hurry." Mrs. Amina arrived at the graveyard and drove to her son's grave. She was always crying and felt empty and lonely. Suddenly, Mrs. Amina noticed a small child standing in front of one of the graves. The child was reaching into a hole next to the grave, holding something white in his hand. Mrs. Amina thought to herself, "Who is this child? What is he doing here?" Mrs. Amina decided to investigate. As she approached the child, she found a letter in his hand. The letter was handwritten and addressed to his deceased mother. Mrs. Amina read the letter and found that the child was complaining to his mother about the lack of affection after her death and the mistreatment by his father and stepmother. The child mentioned in the letter that he had decided to commit suicide the next day. Mrs. Amina thought to herself, "I must save him. I must prevent him from doing this terrible act." Mrs. Amina decided to return to the graveyard the next day to save the child. When she arrived, she found the child standing in front of the same grave, holding a small bottle. Mrs. Amina asked, "My son, what are you doing? Why are you holding that bottle?" The child lost consciousness, and Mrs. Amina said, "I must save him. I must prevent him from doing this terrible act." Mrs. Amina took the child to the nearest hospital, where he received the necessary treatment. After that, she took him to her home, where she cared for him. Later, Mrs. Amina filed a petition in court for the right to care for the child. The judge granted her this right. The child became a compensation for Mrs. Amina for her lost son. She felt happiness and gratitude, as she had saved this child's life and had become a mother to him. If you liked the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to get all the latest updates.